Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Alrighty. So I'm just going to give a couple of seconds. Let me get started. There. I'm not going to match my own excitement today because I am coming down with something. And unfortunately, I think it is going to be. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to set my own future. My roommate has COVID, so I'm hoping it's just me. I'm gonna fight it. But point being, I hope I'm gonna be able to make it through this whole thing because I'm excited. I love talking about this topic with my clients. It is a big topic. I'm gonna go ahead and give you all that heads up. Talking about the personality. Personality as a construct is it's vast. It's has multitude, has a lot of layers to it. Um, but I want to focus a little bit more on a specific part of personality, and that is the intentional attachment that we have to the concept of an addictive personality. So that is the topic today, is like the addictive personality and what that can do for mental health. So I am unfortunately not feeling my utmost best, but hopefully I will fight it off. I've already been I can't really say it. COVID is a very different type of virus. Like it is, it's not just the common cold where you get run down and you're not taking care of yourself. Because if you follow me, you all know that I don't take care of myself like the utmost. There's no perfection, but I do a lot, and it still happens. But I reduce a lot of my own sickness just by the lifestyle that I have shifted into and started living. I used to get sick I don't know, like maybe 3 times a year sometimes, especially like with allergies, and that's not even sickness, like, right? Like but that puts a lot of stress on our body. And so when I've gotten more into that preventative mode and that preventative mindset and done the internal work to reinforce those changes, that's how we align with transformation. But that's not the topic today. So let's dive in the addictive personality. So this is, again, like I said, it is a large topic, but this is where I kind of want to set the tone for you guys, like to get an idea of like, okay, when we talk about addiction, I think addiction is one of those things that not a lot of people like to even really say the word. We bring ourselves to this, visual of, I just saw a video the other day of all of these people who were under the influence of a new drug that leaves them like paralyzed and basically like crumpled on the sidewalks of cities, right? Like this is an epidemic that we're fighting. We had a pandemic, which it wasn't necessarily has nothing to do with the virus, but it was just the amount of space it takes up. But the opioid epidemic has been something that is way minimized within our culture just because it's like, oh, it's scary for people. It touches home. It evokes a lot of feeling. So when we're talking about the addictive personality, we can't even really scratch the surface, I don't think, just generally as a conversation, because the word addict or addiction scares people off to be like, oh no, I'm not that, or I deal with it. I don't want to talk about it because it's painful. Like I watched that video like this week, and I was like, it pains me too that I know someone, within my network who struggles with an actual substance addiction, but because it's personal to me, because I have my own patterns of addiction within, food and sugar and thinking of how and certain things, that it makes it hard for me to watch that and not be in pain, not to feel some kind of suffering. So when we talk about, and before we even get to like, a conversation about addiction, we have to really look at like, why are we resistant to even talking about it in the first place? And so that's something that we all like, I want to kind of maybe shine a light on, is where does addiction come from? That we have a lot of contributing factors. Let's talk about the first obvious one, which a lot of people fall back, is genetics. And when I say fall back, I mean that very intentionally, not to insult anyone, but because there has been a strong correlation between the heritage and family members that it has been passed down, and it does change genetic material. The use of substances changes how our genes are formed and how they develop. And so there has been genes that are linked to predisposition of having addictive behaviors. But I also want you to remember that that's a very small percentage of the pie, because then we have growing up in an environment where you are exposed to addiction. You are exposed to the multitude of options of things that are going to numb your pain, but then when you're not numb, that you are irritable and that it's chaotic. So now you have this conversation between nature and nurture as well, like which one is mostly influential. And where I sit, or at least I try to sit, is that I consider both quite influential. You have to consider both to be the impact that you're dealing with. So whenever you're trying to make a change, if you grew up in a strong in a household where you either saw or knew your parents were using drugs or were struggling with some type of mental illness, you are predispositioned there. But then also, because you're a biological child, you have some potential to have like additional challenges because of your genetic makeup. Now, here's what I'm going to say to that though. When we realize, like, yes, this is a real circumstance for that you are genetically predispositioned, what we also know is that the body is able to repair itself. The body is able to heal itself and to be able to change, just like alcohol and long-term exposure to stress and mental health issues change genetic materials. Having less stress and reduced chaos and what am I trying to say? Just a different environment altogether that can be created also changes genetic material in the way that alcohol or drugs or that stress changed it to begin with. It's called epigenetics, epigenetics. Fascinating concept that goes around. It's more of, it's genetic and it's genetics, right? Like, so that's a whole realm of study for people like these doctors and, are like research the heck out of genetics. And then it has an intersection with neurology and the nervous system and the brain and all of that. So when we start talking about epigenetics and how the addictive personality, we now start to have something that like, oh, there's something kind of in opposition here of what we know about having an addictive personality, something that's not supposed to change, that you're predispositioned to addiction, but yet you also have the ability to heal your brain on a cellular level and to be able to regrow and have new neural pathways to not be in this situation anymore. So we now have something essentially to unpack. Before we were just like, okay, well, what can we pack? It's a suitcase. It's locked. It's genetics. It's not just genetics anymore. Addiction is something that when you allow yourself to realize what you're predispositioned to understand what are your chains. I'm gonna go ahead and call them chains. What are your chains in the things that are holding you back? What has tampered with your internal groundwater, your belief system about yourself and your capabilities and what you're destined to be? Then you have a completely different opportunity and a new open door to consider that you don't have to be that way anymore. That's epigenetics. What we know about the ability to have neuroplasticity, so the brain's ability to regenerate and to be plastic. So that's where it's like, when we talk about change, it's like flexibility. The brain in itself is soft matter. It can change if there's damage to it. We don't want to continue adding to that, but it can also reheal. It can regrow. It can take up new space, that if you give it space, that it will be able to heal itself. Now, will I say it's easy to get from predispositioned to new destiny? No, that's a big old jump. There are a lot of things that have to go into in terms of steps for how we're able to understand and be consistent with rehealing and healing ourselves. But I do want people to hear, first and foremost, when we're talking about the addictive personality, this concept of like, you are only one person. Now, I'm not saying that you have multiple personalities, but you have different parts of yourself that you haven't even really understood if you are trying to buffer yourself from the world. You may have parts of you that you don't want to understand, that are mean and that are angry and that are out of control, which is partly why you drink or you smoke or you do whatever it is that you do. But it is not the only part of you. And we have a lot of different personality insight now, different parts of research and aspects of research that we have delved into that talk about that personality. And so when I say personality, we talked about the addictive personality, but that's more of like something that a lot of people describe themselves as. But personality in general comes down with a multitude of traits. So when you're in therapy, one of the things that we can do, or you don't even really have to go to therapy to do this, is start understanding like what are the traits and the values of your personality. So, but if you say that you have an addictive personality, then you're leading with the ideal of that you are going to be an addict towards this thing. When I'm kind of the spoiler alert is that we all have the ability to become addicted. We all have an addictive personality because it is a chemical imbalance that propels us particularly to become addicted to the outcome of what relief we get from our suffering. So when we talk about like where does addiction come from, genetics is one place. However, that's got some counteractive now. It can balance that's out. But a lot of it is what we're exposed to. So, but you don't stay in the same environment the whole time. You don't, I mean, there's some people who stay in bed all day, which again is going to be an addictive pattern, an addictive cycle. But if you're getting out of bed every day, whether it's made, whether it's their dirty sheets, whatever, you're leaving an environment. So you have the ability to break the pattern of what feels good and feels comfortable. And so when we talk about personality traits, here's this other concept of personality that is pretty much my biggest second point for this topic is how we identify our identity. How we identify our identity. I think I don't have to even know who I am or what I'm about. If I were to walk into a room or to a restaurant and I can say, raise of hands, who's an introvert and who's an extrovert here? Everyone in that place would know what I'm talking about. And so when we talk about how we identify our identity, introvert versus extrovert, and now omnivert is this, the descriptors that we use for how we attach to our identities. If you wanted, because omnivert, let me make sure that's the right word real quick. I'm trying to hold in there with y'all with this voice. Yeah, so omnivert is the individual that fits into the both extroversion and introversion personality spectrum. That sentence right there goes ahead and backs up my point, is that it's a spectrum. We have introverted over here, we have extroverted over here, and then we have multiple traits that kind of support that like surface level label of how we identify certain traits. And the thing that happens when when we're struggling, I'm going to put it back into the context of working with addicts, right? Like how does addiction form? We got genetics, but environment. If your environment, you are exposed to stress to the utmost extreme externally, then you're going to constantly be looking for things that are going to reduce that stress. Your brain and your nervous system are wired as a survival technique to reduce stress at all costs. So if you're exposed to that much stress and you don't have any relief from it, you're going to start seeking out your basic needs at that point now become relief. So you're going to start doing things that limit your openness and your exposure to pain. And so what happens with that is that we start finding ways, now in some ways it's finding pleasure. pain and pleasure balance that out. But in other ways, it's just reducing the pain. And then we find really effective techniques like opiates. Story time. One time, I've had a couple of surgeries in my life, but the most painful experience that I ever had was a kidney stone. This was a summer where I was drinking a lot more, and what I was drinking a lot of ciders, so a lot of sugar. I've never been like super into sweet tea or sodas, but I was drinking a lot of sugar and I was drinking a lot of alcohol. It's a double whammy for my kidneys. And it was summer, so I was becoming more dehydrated just by the second. And I wasn't drinking a lot of water. I was in the water, but I wasn't drinking a lot of it. And by that meaning, I was at the pool. Like this was maybe 7-8 years ago. And it was my birthday, actually. I had never been to the hospital. I've always been like completely averted to hospitals. And on I think it was my 25th birthday, I started getting this like lower back pain, and I was like, oh, I'll go to urgent care tomorrow. I was super aversion. I'm like, I don't like to go to the doctor. I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't doing this. And I remember I was laying on the floor at my mom's house when we were watching a movie. And my friend was home with me at the time. I had just bought this really nice new car. And all of a sudden I just got like, I was like, I have to go to the bathroom. Like, I do not feel good. Like, whatever. So I was in so much pain. I had a very high tolerance to pain. But part of what I didn't realize is that like when your body can't basically trick you into think that you're not being in pain anymore, it's going to try to start eliminating things. So I started getting very sick, started vomiting. And at that point, I was like, okay, I can't avoid this anymore. I have to go to the hospital. This is my 25th birthday, never been to the hospital. I was always like, I'm not paying. Well, my deductible is $500, so I go to the ER. I don't want to do that. I'm not taking an ambulance. So at the time, I was like, all right, my friend had to drive me to the hospital in my own car because that was the only car we had. And I was like, all right, cool. So come to find out, I had a kidney stone. It wasn't just no like lower back pain. I had a grand old kidney stone, the most pain in my whole life. And I had passed it once the x-rays had come back. They were like, yo, you passed this with no, like, you haven't taken any ibuprofen, you didn't take nothing. I was like, no, I was just trying to tough it out. And they gave me Dilaudid. They're like, okay, well, we're going to give you some pain medications because like clearly you're in pain. I couldn't keep down the Zofran. I couldn't keep down anything because I was just in so much pain. And when we go through that much pain, we start to look for that relief. And this is where opiates, they just happen to work. They happen to work really freaking well. And I remember this because this was not only was it a significant life event for me to just experience that immense amount of pain, but it was also during a time where I was working with a lot of people who struggled with opiate addiction. And it gave me the most perspective that I ever needed to go from that much pain of passing a kidney stone 3/4 of the way to having no pain at all. The first thing that I did was probably smile. But the first thing that I did was, can I have some more? That was the first thing that I said. And we are hardwired to do that. Like, not everyone is predispositioned to have this addictive personality from the get-go, but we all have the ability to get there if we're not realizing that what we're exposed to. Now, this is no blame, this is just me noticing, what am I exposed to? I was already predispositioned because of my family history. I was already a food addict at that point with no acceptance of the fact of that. I was helping everyone else. I was going to help everyone else to live their life of recovery. And I still didn't get it after that. But I tell that story because that is where that particular relationship starts. That's where when you have an association from going from an immense pain, whether it's emotional or physical, to an immense relief. There you go. So if we're talking about the addictive personality, if you have a personality to begin with, it can become addicted. At that point, have associations and experiences that reinforce your attachment to that. I can still to this day tell this story with a very real feeling of relief that I can still remember. And that was when the first thing I was like, you know what, I officially understand why people get addicted to this. Now, at the time, I didn't even realize that I was struggling with my own relief system of sugar. And when I was in emotional pain, that I would go towards food and go towards things of coping that would just help me reduce it at all costs. But in terms of extreme physical pain, that right there, you can stay focused on someone else having a problem all you want until you actually experience or have your own association with like, ooh, I can see where this can become a problem. So, yeah, so that's my first part of like, when we're talking about the addictive personality, we have our own associations with pain to pleasure or pain to relief that ultimately reinforce how we attach to this identity of, and then that's, you know, if you or someone who has had been an opiate addict, we now perpetuate that own cycle. And hopefully, you know, maybe seeing this video, you will be able to say like, okay, I need to do something different, because it's very possible to do something different. Is it hard work? Absolutely. It is a lot of hard work, but you're not doing it alone. A lot of times we become very addicted to things because we isolate, because we feel shame, we feel guilt about the fact that we know it's wrong. We're doing something that we know it's wrong, and we get stuck, because when we're doing something alone, no one can help us. No one can see like, oh, maybe this could actually help relieve us from these things. And we become isolated about it. And I know there's probably a bunch of people who are going to see this like, well, I've tried to help people. I've tried to do this. Yes, but if you have to keep trying. Now, not at your own expense, because then you can become like, but to never leave someone isolated to the point where they, because just because they're not accepting help doesn't mean that they won't be capable of reaching out at some point. Leaving the window, leaving the door open for being, and if you're going to be a support system for someone who struggles with addiction, you have to know how to balance of not forcing help on someone, but also not being closed off to offering help to someone. So, the addictive personality, personal experience, genetics, we can now rebalance with epigenetics. But here's the tricky one. I kind of started going into it a little bit, is how do we attach to our own individual identities? So the addictive personality is not just your predisposition from a physical level. It's literally the relief that it maintains throughout your life. That when I counsel people in early recovery, when they get into treatment, that is the best possible scenario, is that you're on a different path already, just exposing yourself to some type of treatment. But it's when they start to identify that they are an addict that I encourage them and caution them to be wary about how they create their reality and what leads them through their recovery. Now, because now I'm not one, I'm never going to tell someone they're not an addict. I'm never going to tell someone they are an addict. And why that is because people have to make their own decisions about what is best for them to be able to live the life that secures them away from the things that they don't want. If someone wants to use drugs, I can't stop that. I as a counselor, someone who's, you know, like, you can't force someone to stop drugs by sending them to jail. There's plenty of drugs in jail. There's plenty of drugs in prison. I saw it for myself. So to tap into the individual's ability to make choices, to help them find a new way to rebalance with epigenetics, to cultivate and to facilitate that process with them, sometimes for them, because you have to be willing to model certain behaviors, saying the hard things, doing some things that lead into, and all the skills that they didn't necessarily learn because they grew up in a household that had dysfunctional ways of doing things, that all of that goes into how they see and attach to their own identity. So think about it this way. My name is Sara. As the number one identity that I lead with in my life, right? And so that right there is it's a part of my personality. I don't go around telling people, hey, my name is Ted. That is my identity. So when we have a label, something that makes us feel um, transferable and understood, people, if they met me and I didn't have an identity, if I didn't have a name, then they would be like, who are you? They would question me like, why don't you have a name? You would be different. So your number one identity and how you label yourself, the words that you use about yourself to describe yourself, reinforce your identity. So if you claim having like, oh, I have an addictive personality, then that is an attachment to an identity that is part of who you fundamentally believe that you are. And I can tell you, if you go back and watch the beginning of this talk, addiction is a fundamental thing that we can all be predispositioned to. It does not discriminate between race, gender, identity. Um, it doesn't. You are a human that has a chemical and genetic predisposition that can be hijacked at any given time. It could scare some people, and my intention actually it wasn't to not scare you, it was to be real with you, right? Like, this is the vulnerability of this conversation. So if you're feeling scared by like, oh shit, I can become an addict at the time, slow down, because that is definitely not going to help you, stay away from becoming an addict. It's going to help actually speed it up, but is for you to not to work on those fears. To when you fear something, you deny it, you are less likely to expose yourself to it, and in turn you deny your exposure and your experience with it, and in turn you do not have any ability to identify that you can overcome fears, right? So if you identify, you're like, oh, I'm scared of the world, you're attaching now to that identity of being avoidant of the world. Now, this is not to go into attachment theory, but can intersect with attachment theory. So a lot of people who I feel like, and I'm happy for this, because a lot of people are like, oh, I'm an anxious attachment, I'm a avoidant, dismissive, whatever. I love that people are starting to identify with that. But I also want to remind you that the goal for identification is to find a way to find security in a secure attachment. So you don't stay where you identify yourself. Therapy is about moving yourself along to the end zone, the end result being a secure attachment, being something different than what you started. And what I see one of the biggest barriers for people to be able to really get and to feel like you're successful, and sometimes feeling and being successful, two different things, but to get to success, to be successful and to feel successful, is that you have not attached yourself to these identities of being an addict. Why? Is because it locks you into your fear. It always, and I don't like to use a whole lot of extreme language, but I feel pretty confident saying it will always leave a layer of fear that you do not believe in yourself to be able to make a different choice. And I can't really prove it. I can send research and papers and evidence-based, peer-reviewed education to you all day, but no one can truly prove that there's like this secret lining of fear that if we attach ourselves to an identity of being something that we don't want to be, that we leave room for becoming it. It's just going to be something that you have to connect with. That if you believe that that's possible, like I did, is that because I watched it. I found generalizations, but they spanned across the different clientele that I was working with, that when we, like, okay, I identify as an addict, you keep your focus on addiction at all point in times versus fundamentally believing that addiction exists and will be a common problem for all throughout the time that your existence continues. So individually, now, if that works for you to lead with that, by all means continue to lead with that. But I would also consider and encourage you to consider that if you were to take that label off, who would you be? Like, if you weren't an addict, what would you be? And that question right there in itself indicates that there's an unknown about yourself that you can't even identify. So when we attach to this identity of being an addictive personality, we limit ourselves ever so much from being able to see that there are way more things that we're capable of, because this internalized stigma of addiction. Like, we have to keep it. We have to keep it in the forefront of our mind, or else we're going to become innately addicted again. That's not the case. It's not the case. Is it hard to understand that? Absolutely. But just because if you struggle with, and you've had relapses, and you've tried sobriety, or you've lost weight and you regained it back, you're doing that because you're missing some of the key work. Now, I'm not saying that I'm the only person that knows the keys, but I know a lot of them because I've taken them and I applied them, and I found what worked for me. But more than likely, if you're seeing this, it's because you've never worked with me. You've never worked with someone else who's willing to help you with a different perspective. I'm not the only person that can provide you a different perspective. And there's a big difference between going to someone and getting perspective versus their opinion or advice. Very big difference, because what happens there is that now someone else is taking their identity, all the things that they're either unintentionally or intentionally attached to, and they're now putting them on a plate and expecting you to eat them. I say expecting very intentionally, because this is where a lot of people start to feel attached and obligated to take the advice of other people and apply it, or else they would disappoint that person. And it starts all the way in childhood. If you don't take your parents' advice, if you don't follow in your parents' footsteps, if you don't do this, or if you don't do that a certain way, that you become a disappointment. You become less than. You made someone mad. And that's where your imbalance starts. That's why fundamentally we can all become addicted to something, because we're now experiencing emotional pain to some degree, and we're now going to start seeking relief from it. Whew. So we talked a little bit about the attachment to what our personalities are. That right there is something that you can do something about it. That's not innately, biologically predisposition to you. But do you have some things you might need to understand? Absolutely. And maybe we'll go into like the different types of personality assessment, and what certain types of things and tasks and skills that you need to learn to be able to change. And this is where I'm like, I can only use my story to provide examples. But if you go back and you ask, actually, you probably don't want to ask my friends and family, because they've seen my transformation. But you can ask my mom and my stepmom, that I was the most shy, introverted, scared. I'm not sure they realized that I was scared, but I was scared of the world. And in a lot of ways, I have less fear now, but there's still parts of the world I'm very similar. I don't want to go to war. My brother does that. I've seen the toll it takes on him. This is already pretty tough shit out here. I don't want to do, if I had to, I know that I could, but I've also had to cultivate that belief system in me to be able to know that I don't have to be scared of the things that may or may not happen here in my life. Point being, I used to be very introverted, and I still have some identity. In my mind, using a lot of mindfulness skills, is that I went from having an attachment that will lock me in to be like, I'm an introvert, to going to an S hook. And no, it just happens that it's an S. It's my name. There we go. Oh, okay. It's straight here. It's backwards on the screen. But maybe if I do it like this, yeah, an S hook. If we're having our ability to hook on to something that brings us structure, that brings us peace, because identity is a part of that peace. You have to know who it is, who you are, what you're working towards, what your values are. But instead of having it like this to everything that you've experienced that identifies who you are, if you're struggling with change, we need to change it to an S hook. So you have the ability to have a strong hold, Look, I'm pulling hard, y'all. It's strong, but it also can let go. So when you're working on with attachment theory with your therapy sessions or identifying, and if you work with me in my short term, like my coaching program, I would encourage you, to practice how you get from this. So what's like, oh, my name is Sara. I'm an introvert. My name is Sara. I have introverted tendencies, but I have trained myself to be extroverted. The only reason I'm sitting here talking to the void of social media and people that I can't see, and I'm not afraid of what people think of me anymore, to a certain extent. But I do care what people think of me, but at the same time, I'm not eating it up like it's my main course of my life, because it's like, oh, I gotta operate here. And I don't submit myself into the fear of being introverted and being exhausted. Introversion has a large component of internal exhaustion, because really you're just identifying in something, you're just attaching to it, and then you're overlooking what is happening behind the scenes, what's happening in the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. And you're dealing with a lot of anxiety about social situations, being accepted in social situations, which is all something that can be worked on. It's all something that can be changed. Now, you're not going to become extroverted, but a lot of people who attach to extroversion, as a therapist, that tells me that you need more self-care time. You're less likely, not just because you're an extrovert, and I don't mean this for everyone, but because if a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'm more extroverted than this, there might be a lot of fear of being in committed relationships because of, having previous partners and hurt that keep you just like going and getting your needs met from other people. That right there, a lot of extroversion has an imbalance within codependency. And then it also can be a very isolating experience, because we've all heard that topic, or not topic, but that saying that you can be alone in a room full of people. And guess who usually relates to those things? Extroverts. Introverts, I think, related to it too, but that's the thing, is like when the personality spectrum, if things are on a spectrum, and I think we've all, well, at least if you come into my room, you come into my lovely couch, that we're going to talk about how life is a spectrum. If a spectrum is a line, well, it can be more than a line, but I put everything on the linear spectrum, right? And if you have more of these things over here, what's naturally going to happen? You're going to become imbalanced. If you have more things on the extroverted side, you're going to become imbalanced. So we have to put effort towards rebalancing things. And just like a physical injury, if you had an injury, this has happened to me, I had a foot injury. And this is where I really learned the highly importance of taking care of your feet. I'm only 34, y'all, and I already got bad feet. That when you don't care for something, when you get injured, you have an injury, you end up compensating. You compensate for that injury. So because it was my foot, I was walking like that, right? My gait was very staggered because I was trying to put less pressure on my injury. What happens at that point, now my hips get out of line. Now it pulls. I still to this day struggle with like back pain. And because of this injury, and I corrected a lot of it, but it easily, if I do not take care of myself, if I do not stay in maintenance mode, then I slide back, it becomes imbalanced again. So this all goes into an addictive personality, because when you lock yourself and you attach yourself to one certain identity, then you're not allowing yourself to see like, okay, are there possibilities for me to be something else? Because, and a lot of people don't like to do this, and this could pretty much just be like the ending to most of my videos, is why don't people like to do that, Sara? And you know what? I'm so glad you asked, because it doesn't look like anything. It's a void. It's the unknown. No one likes to look out into a black room and like what's there? In our imagination, everything that we're already dealing with is just playing this narrative and this script to be like, ooh, this is going to happen. This is what's going to happen. So all of our fears now come forward. So when we look at the unknown, we're seeing a whole video or a movie of the worst case scenario of the things that our fears are telling us will happen now as the primary video. But there's nothing there. There's really nothing. Like the unknown, I'm not going to say it's written already. I don't know. I don't know. But I know that I don't know. Like I know that the unknown is something that I don't know and that I can't control. And that's why most people start to control prior to even getting to a point where the unknown can even be visible. I hope that makes sense for everyone. Like I told you at the beginning, this is a complex. And it's not that because it's complex, like it's hard to understand. It's because it is intersectional. We went to a lot of different places to be able to just talk about one thing, which is, do you identify with being an addictive personality? And if you do that, then you are attaching yourself to and focusing on the concept of being an addict, and therefore holding space for the belief system that you can revert back to that person, which is, it's possible. But what also is possible is that if you didn't attach to that identity of being an addict, could you actually have a different belief system and protect yourself from the possibility of reverting back to that person? I live in the world of like, I'm not going to identify as an addict, but I will identify as a recovering food addicted person, because I know fundamentally I'm still a human. I just have a very different belief system now. I have a very different way of thinking about how to protect myself, give myself a lot of buffer room from being able to get back into that long-term cycle of, and because it stems from our belief system, but it ultimately works into my thinking. It works into how I feel. It can cause me to feel even more triggered, and then I go to those things. That does not mean I don't binge still. I do. My binging, I just had a bunch of ginger snap cookies last night. And I did not proportion them out. I didn't do this, but I've also found different ways of coping. I've also found different ways to prevent me from going back full blown into that all or nothing. I need relief, because I've balanced out different parts of my biochemistry and different parts of my awareness, and then my faith system has also realigned within that. I've activated the mind, body, spirit triangle to all work together. And that's what I help people do. So it can be quite challenging. I thought I was going to go more into like the biochemistry part of it, but let's just know you got a whole lot of hormones, going off. And when you work with me, I give you a whole breakdown of like all those different intersections. I give you a breakdown of, because you also have to learn where yours are at. If you have to balance hormone levels, that is a process in itself. So, I think that's about it though. I had one more thing though, is I want to just say this. Stopping what you're doing is challenging in itself. Like if you know that you have to change, going cold turkey, going and taking an immense amount of time off, all of that can work. But when we're looking at sustainability, what will work longer, what will work with more protective factors, just continuing to do what you're always doing, which is not always drugs, it's doing it on your own, is usually the problem. That concept of just keep going. I see it. It's motivational. I even use it. I use it as encouragement. But to just keep going, I want y'all to remember, if I had any say of like brainwashing you today, is that we are all on different journeys for a reason. To just keep going and not include anyone in on your journey we've been put in different places and in different parts of our journeys for a reason, to educate each other on what it is that can happen in other people's lives and what can happen in other people's recoveries. There's a lot of uncharted territory that we don't know. But when the biggest problem with, I think, the addictive personality, and I said this earlier, is that we isolate. That just because we're on a different path doesn't mean that we ever step off that path into someone else's to see whether or not we can learn from them or we can gain something that we can take back to our own path. And so when we come into this mindset, the biggest problem with the addictive personality and that attachment is you secure a small seed of isolation and thinking that you have to do everything on your own. But when you do things, I don't mean you have to do it with a crowd, you don't have to do it with a whole lot of people, but you don't ever stop and just observe someone else, that you're not able to really to keep going on your journey. You're going in circles at that point because you'll never realize that your circle never intersects with someone else's. The intersections in our journeys are where we can tell what direction that we're going in, if we're going in a positive direction, because then we're able to get some perspective over what it is that we're trying to work towards. And that's a lesson I've had to learn, more in the last few years with working towards my business, because I do work alone. Even though perspective is one of my favorite concepts, it's still challenging to receive it. It is. It's tough. And doing it alone is just, it's not possible. It's not feasible. It will take you entirely way too long, to the point where you drive yourself to an early death. So just remember, when you are encouraged by the concept of just keep going, it also has its detriments. And to really consider that just keep going means doing something just a little bit different in the process of doing what it is that you're doing. Hopefully that made sense to y'all. And I will see you guys next Friday. And hopefully, whatever I can tell that I'm struggling with, like talking a little bit too much, and I'm going to go actually, I cleared my afternoon already, at least until my afternoon meeting. I am going to lay down and close my eyes, because between this light and talking so much, I need some tea. I need some tea. So you guys have a great Friday. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope to see you back here next week.